So just to finish off this particular section, what we're going to do now is add validation to our activity form to prevent the user from sending up an activity via our form that doesn't meet our validation requirements. Now, it's important to emphasize here that client-side validation can be very, very easily worked around. We've already seen that we can use a tool like Postman to attempt to send up data to our server. So server-side validation is extremely important, and client-side validation is a nice to have, and it also prevents our browser from trying to send up invalid data to our server. But it's not bulletproof and it's very easily worked around, and there's nothing you can do about that. But what you can do is include server-side validation to prevent that from happening. But what we're going to do now is take a look at client-side validation, and what we're going to do is use a library to help us with this, and the one that we're going to use is called revalidate. And if we just take a look at the documentation here inside the GitHub repo for this particular package, it's basically a library for creating and composing small validation functions to create complex and robust validations. Now this is going to create a validation object for us, and we can utilize this validation object inside final form. And if we take a look at what we need to do, we just need to install this package. And if we go and take a look at the docs, which I already have open here, and what we're going to use inside here is a couple of functions. We're not going to, inside the usage, we've got lots of different options here, but the ones we're going to use the combine validators. And this is going to allow us to validate multiple field values at once. And it returns a function that takes an object with field names mapped to their values. And if we take a look at its usage here, then it's pretty straightforward. We just create this function based on the fields that we want to validate against. And it's a pretty simple example. And there's a couple of fields inside here, name and age, and using the is required, is alphabetic for the name, and is numeric for the age. And we can also put our own custom messages inside here as well. So not too much theory on this, and we'll just go ahead and actually use it. So what we'll do is we'll go and install this into our application, and then we'll make use of it to validate our fields. So we'll head back to VS Code, and the first thing we need to do, and I've got some warnings here that we'll need to clean up as well, and we'll do that also in this particular lesson. But for now, I'm just going to go to the terminal, and once again, please make sure you're in the client app here, and I'll say npm install revalidate and press return. And this has gone ahead and installed revalidate 1.2.0. And what we'll do inside our form, we'll just create a validate function. So we'll say const validate equals, and then we'll use combine validators, and this is not automatically importing, which is normally an indication that this library probably doesn't come with a type definition file. So I'm going to attempt to import the combine validators from, and I'll just say revalidate. And sure enough, we're going to get the warning to tell us that it doesn't have a type definition file. So let's go ahead and see if we can get the type definitions and install them. And I'll just paste this in, npm install @types/revalidate. And this has gone ahead and installed those as well. So let's go ahead and create our validate function. So I'm going to say const validate equals combine validators, and inside here what we'll do is we'll specify our fields that we want to validate against. So I'll say the title, and I'll say is required, and now we can automatically import what we need. So I'm going to bring in is required from revalidate, and we can either just specify the title as the name of the field we're validating against, or if we want to provide a custom message, then what we can do is give it a message property, and then we can specify whatever we want to put inside our validator. And I'll say event title is required. And we can do the same for category. Again, we'll say this is required. And I'll just specify category in this case as the default name for the field, and then this will just give it the default message from revalidate, just to save us a bit of typing. In the description, we'll do something slightly different here. And this time we'll use the compose validators so that we can add more than one validator to one of our fields. And I'll need to open some parentheses, and inside here we'll say is required, and I'll just say description. And we can also say has length greater than, so that we ask the users to give a description more than a number of characters. And we can specify 4 as the number of characters. And in here, in the configuration, let's give this a message, and we'll say description needs to be at least 5 characters. And we also need to add some additional parentheses here as well. And then we'll say the city is required, and we'll just specify city. And then we'll do the same for venue. Say is required and venue. And we also need to do the same for the dates is required, and we'll say dates, and then we'll do the same for the time, and once again is required and time. So those are our validators. Pretty straightforward to set this up, because all of the hard work is taking place inside the package we imported. And inside final form, what we can do is we can add another property to this called validate, and then we just pass our validate function to it. Now if we go and take a look at our form, what we should find now, and I'll just click on the create activity, what we should find is that each one of these, as we click on them, displays an error message. Well, they all do except for 3, and that's the category, the date, and the time. And if I click on the category and click out, it's not really possible to touch this particular input without actually selecting something. If I just refresh the page and I touch the inputs and I click out, then it automatically selects the category for us. So we don't need to worry so much about validating against that one. But we do need to deal with the date and the time here. There's 2 problems actually. One of them is that I can actually type text into this. And whilst it does disappear afterwards, it is a bit weird. And if I try and... I can also add text there as well. And clicking out, it does reset the field. But we can also prevent the user from typing in there in the first place. So let's deal with the date and time validation. And we'll go back to the date inputs. And what we're missing inside here is the onBlur event, because that's responsible for notifying the component that it's been touched. So what we'll also add in here is the onBlur, and we'll just say the inputs.onBlur, same as the onChange, because we're not spreading our input properties inside our datetime picker, we need to explicitly use the onBlur event inside the input here. So let's just take a look at that. And we should find that the dates and the time are now required. And if I go back, there's one more change we need to make in here as well. And what we can use is the onKeyDown. And this is the native onKeyDown event called, and calling prevent default, that should probably say, will prevent any custom behavior. So what we can do is inside here is say E and pass it the event and say E prevents defaults. And this will prevent typing into the field in the first place. And if we just go back to our browser, we should find now that we can't actually type into our fields. and we can only select using the dates or time picker. And that's the way we'll keep it. That will prevent any users from typing in. Even though this date picker handles it quite well, it simply resets the value to null if there's any bad data in there. We can just prevent it by using the onKeyDown change handler. So we're almost there with validation. What we also want to do is prevent our users from submitting the form when there's invalid fields. So what we also need to do is head back to VS Code, and inside our activity form is also pass down some properties, some additional properties to our button to disable this. And as well as the handle submit, we can pass down invalid, and we can also pass down pristine. And what we want to do is disable our submit button if the form is either invalid or it's in a pristine state. And if we head down to our button, and we're already disabling it if we're loading our activity, and let's add an OR condition here so that it's also disabled if the form is invalid or the form is pristine, to prevent the users from submitting the form if A, they've not made any changes, or B, the form is actually invalid. So if we head back to our activity form, we can see that our submit button is disabled, and let's take a look, and we can see our description, our second validator in our description also needs to be passed as well. And let's add our date and a time and just some nonsense for the city and the venue, and then our submit button becomes available, and then we can submit our data to the server. And if we click on manage an event, we should find that the submit button is disabled, and if we make one of these fields invalid, then it's also disabled as well. Unfortunately, we don't see the validation message until we click out in this particular case. But this is good enough for the time being. And just to finish off, what we'll also do is clean up these warnings in our activity form. So let's go back to our activity form, and there's a few things we're not bringing in anymore. The activity we don't need inside here, nor do we need the clear activity. And if we look at the top, we've got our interface for iActivity form values that we don't need, and also form event we don't need anymore in here either. And let's just make sure our console is clean. And indeed it is. And this finally brings us to the end of the forms section. So what we'll also do is just commit all of our changes up to GitHub. And we'll say end of section 11. And stage these changes and commit them. And then just push these on up to GitHub. And we'll finish this off with a summary.